From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. This is one thing that I think we need to emphasize, Peter. This story, something really disturbs me about it, is this story may not have come to light ever without your work. And I believe it will be helpful for us to explore a bit of your personal genesis of exploration here. So folks may not know, but you and I were talking off air. You actually began your reporting career less than a year after this incident occurred, and you're in the region. You are connected with this. The question that I think is on a lot of people's minds is what inspired you, or what drove you 5 decades later to dive into this story, and how did you start putting these pieces together? I mean, just learning about your process almost makes me visualize one of those old school like crime boards with the red string connecting one thing to another. Like how did this come about? I'd be really curious to learn.
It's a great question. And the reason I wrote the book in the first person is I wanted to explain that question. I mean, what kind of person after 50 years goes back to try and examine a case like this, financing the investigation essentially on my credit cards? I mean, I didn't get an advance for a book. I didn't, no one was like helping me out when I did this initial investigation. But I was a young cub reporter. I always wanted to be a newsman. I talk about this in the book from the moment I was throwing copies of papers on porches at the age of 10. And then in 1967, I was an undergraduate at Northeastern University in Boston. They have this program called Co-op. And for 6 months, the first summer, from June to December, I learned the craft of journalism. How do you write a 5-point lead? How do you read upside down when the cops don't want to show you the accident report? How do you interview people? How do you get people to tell you things, et cetera? Now, because I was a local boy, a townie, I'd grown up there, that helped a lot. My mother was the deputy clerk of the Superior Court, a total Rosie the Riveter of the law, never even went to college, let alone had a law degree, but she was so good at it that they kept her throughout the 60s and 70s. Everybody knew her. And so I was, I had a good support system in Newport. So the first year, and I got a chance to cover the America's Cup races, the jazz and folk festivals. I mean, Newport, for a town of, it was then 46,000 people when the ships were in, before the Navy left. Now it's more like 26,000. But back in those days, it was an incredibly small space that had all kinds of international events happening all the time. So I cut my teeth on some amazing news stories, national and international news stories, while I was learning the job. But 8 months when I got there in June, the whole town is buzzing. Oh, Doris Duke, she got away with murder. And I was a freshman in college at the time. I was focusing on that. I didn't really know much about it. And so that stuck in my craw. The second summer, I actually did a 4-part expose on slum housing in Newport, substandard housing, because I grew up within 100 yards of this ancient African-American community, one of the oldest in America. Many descendants of enslaved people still live there. And this neighborhood had been thriving until the 1850s, and eventually with Jim Crow, et cetera, had deteriorated into essentially a ghetto. And the black kids from my grammar school, which is right across the street, when I was in the 6th grade, some conservative naval officer got on the committee and gerrymandered the school district. So all the black kids had to go to an inferior school 6 blocks south. And, the white kids from way far away, the doctors and lawyers and the sons of daughters of the slumlords, could go to this good school, right? So that kind of stuck with me. So the second summer I was there, I decided to do an expose on slum housing, and it got printed in the Daily News, 4-part series, and they won this award called the Savellin Brown Award, given by the New England AP managing editors. No paper under 100,000 had ever won it. The Boston Globe came in third, and the Daily News sold 15,000 copies a day. And I just found out the year after we won that award, they changed the rules that said only 100,000 circulation papers could participate. But it really shook up the town. it created, and it had a wild effect, believe it or not, on Doris Duke's restoration work, which I talk about in the book. But they set up a community housing corporation to build houses like Habitat for Humanity for the people that live there. They set up an escrow fund the first night of the series ran. And it really had an impact. So that really defined my career as an investigative reporter. I thought, if I could achieve something like that in a local town at that age, what else could I do? And that really is why I decided to become an investigative reporter for the rest of my career.
Wow. Now, Peter, we look up to you a lot. It's pretty obvious. We all make true crime shows. We've all kind of individually worked on true crime podcasts and IP. And just the fact that, you've learned so much, you've been on these kinds of investigations. One of the hardest things that I personally have found, and maybe Ben and Noel, you guys have found this too, is trying to get information out of officers of the law. And it's often because they, for one reason or another, they can't or won't speak to a certain, investigation. How did you get information? How have you kind of navigated getting information from police officers and from police departments?
Well, I began with a blank slate, essentially. I decided in the summer of 2018, I had just finished adapting my last two HarperCollins books into a 10-hour scripted dramatic series. My mid-career was in Hollywood. We could talk about that later. And I happened to see a rerun of the Trump statement on CNN. I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and not lose any votes. Bing, a light bulb went off, and I went, Doris Duke. And I'd always kind of wanted to get into it, and I never had the skill or the time to do it. My life got in the way, So I just decided to start, and there was a Facebook group, a dedicated, still is, Facebook group called If You Grew Up in Newport, Rhode Island, Share Some Memories. Had 10,500 members. And every 3 or 4 months, a guy named Larry Betancourt, a member of the group, who now has his own group, would post crash photos of the Eduardo Torella crime scene, death scene. And so I started mining that group. I kind of came out and saying, hey, I'm Peter Lance. I'm a Newporter. I'm trying to find out. And because it was a legend, still to this day, it's a legend. Every time people have friends from out of town and they take them around the Ocean Drive past Bellevue Avenue, they wax eloquent about this incident that Doris Duke got away with murder. Everybody believes it in the town, but no one had ever really tried to prove it one way or the other. And I want to start by saying, I never, ever set out with a goal as an investigator. I don't say, okay, I want to prove that Doris did this. That's fatal to any investigation, as you guys know. Once you do that, you start excluding evidence that might be exculpatory. So I just let the Ouija board of investigation take me where it will. And in this case, about 4 really important police officers who had worked the case and who knew fragments of the story but didn't know the whole story opened up to me. One officer was called Detective Al Conti. He did not work the case, but he was a celebrated detective who got millions of dollars in jewelry, the stolen on Bellevue Avenue, recovered over the year. He helped me try to get the police report that had been, quote, missing for years. And I knew that the police department had it, but they denied it. He helped me with that. And most importantly, he put me together with Edward Angel. And Eddie Angel was the first officer on the scene that night, who's the one that found the skin and the blood in the middle of Bellevue. And he's the one that told me Fred Newton's theory of the crash. And that was a crucial piece. Another officer, Bill Watterson, interviewed Doris briefly at Newport Hospital, where they took her before she got locked away. He then went back to the scene and he found Eduardo's passport under the vehicle. He described the injuries that Doris at that point had when he saw her in the hospital as steering wheel injuries, like as if prior to seatbelts and restraints, what would happen if you hit your head on the steering wheel? A cut lip, a bruised nose. And then another officer, Norman Mather, is retired in Florida. These men are all retired. He told me that he was there that night, and when the chief arrived, Chief Radisey, he literally said, okay, Mather, you go write it up. Go back and write it up. So he goes back to the police station, but the last vision he had was the chief arm in arm with Doris walking into Rough Point. Now, is that when the deal was cut? We don't know. We weren't there. But what happened when he got to the headquarters, he was typing up the report in triplicate, as was the case back then, carbon paper in between the pages. And all of a sudden another sergeant ripped it out of the machine, crumpled it up and threw it in the basket saying, the chief has this now. And the next day, this guy, who was then a probationary officer who could have been fired at any time, went in and knocked on the chief's door and said, Chief, what's going on? He said, Mather, this is my case. Now get the hell out of here. And basically, don't let the door hit you on your way out, kind of thing. And that was his contribution to the story. So many of these people were important, and we're going to get I'm sure we're going to get by the end of this first hour to this new living witness that came forward. But when this witness came forward, he basically dovetailed everything that I had documented that Fred Newton had said about the 6 intentional acts that led to Eduardo's death. And that was what caused the Newport Police Department to reopen the case last summer.
So quick question, just for anyone unfamiliar with law enforcement. Is it somewhat unusual for a police chief to take a specific case and make it, quote unquote, their case?
It's very unusual. It's unusual to take the person of interest, which is a new term, but the suspect. I mean, she wasn't even a suspect. It was undisputed that she was behind the wheel when she killed this man. And Rhode Island law says that what was then called the Registry of Motor Vehicles had to investigate, had to do an interview with all people in vehicular homicides. But those 2 individuals, Mr. Parati and Mr. Mazzarone, who's now dead, were not able to even get near her to do that. Okay. So, and then this is, I have to tell you, this proves the cover up by the cops. I just have to throw this in now. So what happened was there's a Newport lawyer named Bill O'Connell. I went to school with his brother, Jamie O'Connell, who's a famous doctor in Boston, went to Harvard Med, and he ministers to the poor and the homeless of Boston. He's very famous, Dr. James O'Connell. And Bill O'Connell, I asked him about this, and he said, Peter, I had heard from Joe Houlihan, and Joe Houlihan, so this is double hearsay now. Joe Houlihan was a remarkable Newport lawyer. He represented me at one point. He's a wonderful guy, and he worked for a while with Doris Duke's lawyer, Aram Arabian, who was kind of the Roy Cohn of New England at the time. He was brilliant but ruthless, okay? And Joe, who'd been doing civil work, wanted to learn criminal, so he would sit as second seat at trials just to observe Adam's technique. And he told Bill, who told me, that after this first, Radice, basically the chief, this interview happened on a Sunday. The incident happened Friday at 5 o'clock in the afternoon on the 7th of October. So now we're at the 9th, at around in the afternoon. They interview her, and then a 4-question interview, and the case is closed the next morning at 10 a.m. Chief Radice announces to the AP, UPI, and the New York Daily News, which had a veteran reporter in town, okay, the case is done, accident. And then the Attorney General of Rhode Island at the time said, don't rush to judgment. This is happening too fast. So Radice literally walked it back. He called the press back an hour later and said, oh, no, the case is still open. It's still open. And so what happened then, according to O'Connell through Houlihan, which I proved ultimately in my investigation, is that the chief went to Aram Arabian. The chief of police goes to the lawyer for the suspect and says, Aram, you got to help me come up with something to close out this case because the AG's all over me. And Aram says, I'll tell you what, you write up a transcript of an interview with her. And the chief goes, you mean you want to interview her more extensively? No. You're not going to interview her. Just do a transcript like you did interview her. And in fact, they typed up a phony 3-page transcript of an interview, Q&A, 3 pages that never took place, even though it says at the top, this interview is being conducted by this interrogation by Captain Paul Sullivan at Rough Point, such and such a time, the next day, the 11th of October. And how do we know it's a fake? Because the first question they ask, they get Doris's birth date wrong. They say she's born in 1928. Her answer, when in fact it was 1912. She crosses out the 28 and initials DD. Now, if a stenographer had been doing this in real time, she or he would have caught the mistake in real time and would have been reflected in the transcript. These are the lengths they went to. And then when Mr. Parati from the state asked the chief to get the transcript, he said, oh, you don't need that. You got the transcript of the other one, the little 4-question one. That's good enough. You don't need this. Why did the chief hide it from the state? Because he knew anybody with a brain could have seen that mistake and realized it was a fraud. But the cover-up was already in motion at that point. Doris was ready to write her check to the Cliff Walk Restoration and Newport Hospital, and by then it was done. And Bill Watterson said to me, I said to him, did any of you guys object? He said, listen, Peter, the chief was the kind of guy, he had absolute power. He could rip the badge off your chest, and all of us had families. We had careers. None of us could buck the chief at the time.